Today's daf we're going to be learning is Avodah Zarah Daf Nun Aleph. Yesterday we brought up the issue of both when it comes to the death penalty and when it comes to forbidding something to benefit from. If we're talking about tikrovet Avodah Zarah, something that we bring to worship idols with, will I be liable to death penalty? Will the item be forbidden to benefit from? All that depends on whether it was brought as an item that um, in a way that was done in the temple, the way sacrifices are brought, shchita, zvicha, all that. And what we saw was that we ended our Gemara with Rav's statement, Avodah zarah she'ovdim ba b'makel, if you worship that Avodah zarah with a stick, shavar makel b'fanei chayav, zarak makel b'fanei patur. And what's the reason? It needs to be like zvicha, like zrika. And this is not similar to zrika. So now the Gemara is going to suggest, starting on the third line of today's daf, lema ketanai, perhaps this is a subject of a machloket tanaim. Because look at this source. Shachat lachagav, Rabbi Yehuda mechayev, chachamim potrein. Now, Rabbi Yehuda says if you slaughter a grasshopper for the Avodah Zarah, now we don't do that in the temple. On the other hand, it's similar to slaughter. Just like we don't break a stick, it's very similar because it's this idea of breaking, like breaking the neck of the animal, breaking the stick, slaughtering the grasshopper. So Rabbi Yehuda obligates. The rabbis accept. So why don't we say, my lava kami palgate? Maybe this is the root of the machloket. Temar savar minan kein zvicha. Umar savar lo minan kein zvicha ela kein pni. One holds it just needs to be similar to slaughtering. So that would mean cutting off a head, getting rid of cutting off the head of a grasshopper would be the same. And that would be the same issue here, breaking the stick. That would be rough. But Marsavar, the Chachamim, then that's Rabbi Yehuda, who's obligating. The rabbis say, no, it has to be Elakaim Panim. It has to be like something done inside. It has to be like actually slaughtering an animal, not slaughtering grasshopper. You don't do that inside. You don't break sticks inside the temple, so you wouldn't be obligated. Now, the issue here in this source is obligated the death penalty. To which the Gemara says, lo. You misunderstood Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Yehuda doesn't hold it. It has to be Kain Zvicha. Okay, everyone agrees in this Tanaitic debate that it doesn't need to be like the way you did it there. Ela Kain Pnim Be'inan. You really need it to be like what was done inside. Okay, now we're going to say neither of them hold like Rav. It has to be similar to what's done in the temple. Now, slaughtering a grasshopper is actually a lot more similar to slaughtering an animal than breaking a stick. So it turns out that we thought that Rav were trying to suggest maybe it's a Tanaitic debate, and he holds by Rabbi Yehuda. In the end, we see that it's possible to explain that actually none of them would have agreed with Rav. Had they been alive when Rav was there, they wouldn't have agreed with him. Amar Rav Nachman, Amar Rav Ravua, Amar Rav. Okay, another statement of Rav. Avodah zarah she'ovdim ota b'makel, shavar makel b'fanei chayav v'ne'aseret. Zarak makel b'fanei chayav ve'ena ne'aseret. So now we have this distinction. If you worship this Avodah zarah specifically with a stick, then if somebody goes and breaks the stick in front of that idol, he's obligated and it's forbidden. Because again, breaking a stick is like slaughtering, and this is anyway the way you worship that animal. But zarat makel lefaneh, you will be chayav. Now we start to see sometimes we actually distinguish between chayav mavet, you're liable to death penalty, but ena ne'eseret. But the makel doesn't become forbidden, the stick that you used. So Amalei Rav Nachman, Maishna shaval dehavi lekein zvicha, zarak nami hava lekein zrika. But really, why would you distinguish between breaking and throwing? Because breaking is like slaughtering and throwing is like zrika. So Amalei, Be'ina zrika mishtaberet v'leika. So now we go back to the answer we saw before, which is no, it's not a zrika that drips like the blood, and therefore it's not forbidden to benefit from. But since this is the way people generally worship that idol, therefore you will be liable the death penalty. So now they say, Elameata, according to this though, Avnei Beit Markulis, Bamei Yasru. How are you going to forbid the stones of Beit Markulis? Because they're also just tikrovet avodah zarah, and right, even though that's the way you worship it, but if you throw them, right, we said throwing them is not like zrika. So you're missing the parallel action in the temple. So Amarle, the response he had, okay, this is Rava said to Rav Nachman, what's the difference? Rav Nachman answered, you need Zrika Mishtaberet. So then he asked, right then, presumably Rava asked Rav Nachman, well, then what about Avnei Beit Merkulis? To which Rav Nachman answers, Af Ledidi Kashali, I have the same question. Ushalti al Rabba Baravua, I asked Rav Baravua, but Rabba Baravua l'Chia Barav, he didn't know the answer. He asked Chia Barav. Chia Barav l'Rav. Chia Barav asked Rav himself. And Rav answered, Naseh kimegadel avodah zarah. When you throw that stone onto Merkulis, it basically it becomes part of the idol and it makes the idol bigger. And therefore, it becomes an idol for idol worship. And that's why by throwing it, even though it's not like Zrika, it's because it's not viewed as a tikrovet. It's not viewed as an offering that has to be like Zrika. It's viewed as you just built up the idol. But this is going to create a problem. Why? Well, based on this machloket, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva that we learned in the past, we're going to learn again at the end of today's daf in the Mishnah. It's only going to work according to one of them, and you'll see right now. Because if you're of the opinion that the Avodah Zarah of a Gentile is forbidden immediately, then it makes sense. Because as soon as you throw that stone onto the Merkulis pile, it becomes an idol. And even though the idol wasn't worshipped yet, because the previous idol was worshipped, but the stone wasn't worshipped yet. So it makes sense. And then also the question would be, every time you throw stones, you keep throwing stones, the stones just get bigger, but no one ever worshipped that idol because you haven't worshipped it. So, Ella, Lamanda, Amar, Aj, Teaved. Okay, so that, but if we don't, sorry, I didn't say it clearly. If you hold that it actually is forbidden immediately, even without worshiping it, then you're fine. Because then it's forbidden immediately because it was actually worshipped by throwing this big. Amarle. Rav. Amarle. So Rav Nachman answers, Afla Didi Kashali. I have the same question as you. V'shaltia l'Rabba Baravua, v'Rabba Baravua l'Chia Barav, v'Chia Barav l'Rav. So each rabbi passed from Rabba Baravua to Chia Barav to Rav. And Rav answered, Amarle Naseh Migadel Avodah Zarah. What happens is as you throw it, you're actually building up the Avodah Zarah. So it's not a tikrovet, it's not an offering that has to be like Srika. It's actually building up the Avodah Zarah, the idol. But this only works according to one opinion of a machloket we've seen before of Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael. Hanicha, this works if you hold Lamanda Amar Avodah Zarah Shalovei Kochavim Asuramiyat. If you hold, when a Gentile creates an idol, the moment the idol is created, the idol is forbidden. And it makes perfect sense. You threw the stone, it became part of the idol's forbidden, including the new stones. Ela Lamanda Amar Aj Teaved. But the one who said that the Gentiles' idols are not forbidden until they're actually worshipped, well, tishtare, you should permit it to halopalcha because you haven't worshipped it. If all you did was throw the stone and the stone became part of the idol, you're just creating a bigger idol. You're not actually worshiping it. So it's never been worshipped yet, meaning maybe the previous part was worshipped at some point, but the ones you throw on it are never worshipped because until someone actually brings an offering to Markulis, but by throwing the stones, they're not. So the halopalcha, because nobody worshipped it. So Amarle. So okay, seems like this was after Rav answered the question and then got back to Rava. Rava asked Rav Nachman this question. Well, it only works according to one of those opinions. So Amarle, Nachman answered him, now we're going to explain it like this. Every time they throw stones, those stones become part of the idol, but at the same time they function as an item brought to worship the pile that was already there. So every time you throw a stone, it also is a tikrovet, which then was used to worship the idol. So now the idol is actually considered worshipped. All the stones that were there before, every stone that was previously thrown there is now a worshipped idol, which will be forbidden. And also, though, it's not really a tikrovet, and that's why it doesn't have to be like Srika, because it itself becomes the idol. That all works fine, except for, if you caught this, the last stone you just threw. The last stone should actually be permitted because the last stone only was used to build the idol, and that stone hasn't been worshipped yet because it's not worshipped by the idols, by the stones that are already there, right? That last stone hasn't yet been worshipped. As soon as somebody brings a new stone, the previous stone will have been worshipped now. But that last stone actually should be permitted, to which Rav Nachman answers him, Amarle, if you can actually identify which stone was the very last one, you're right. It's actually permitted. Rav Ashi Amar, he explains it differently though. He says, actually, even the last one is forbidden because each one is both a tikrovet to itself, and a tikrovet to its friend. So that means that when you throw this stone, actually it is being worshipped by the other stones that are already there, as if they're being offered to the one you just threw, and therefore they all become forbidden at the same time, and they all become both worshipped and part of the idol at the same time. Tanan. Now we bring a Mishnah. Matzah b'rosho ksut ma'ot okelim. This Mishnah, okay, we're in this Gemara, it's kind of funny. We already quoted the Machlok of Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Kiva, which is going to be the Mishnah at the end of today's daf. And now we're quoting a different Mishnah we're going to see later on. It says in the Mishnah, Matzah b'rosho ksut u'ma'ot okelim hara'elu mutarim. If you find on the head of the idol clothing or money or vessels, they're all permitted. Pirkulei avnavim ba'atarot shel shibalim v'yenot u'shmanim v'slatot. So if you have clusters of grapes or crowns of stalks, wheat stalks, and wine, oil, and solet, fine flour. Any items, right? Not clothing and vessels and money, but all the other items, the fruits and the wine and the oil, are items and therefore they're asur. They're forbidden. Now, there's a difficulty in the original halach of Rav. The wine, the oil, the solet, the fine flour, it both is something you bring inside, it's libations in the Beit HaMikdash, and also it has the whole element of things trickle down. It's like sprinkling the blood. Ela parkilav and avim atarot shel shibalim. Right? Both you don't bring those inside really, and they're not like zrika where they fall apart. When we talked about those kind of things being forbidden, we're talking about when you cut them with the intent of using them for idol worship. Okay, and if you do that when you have the intent when you cut them, now we have an action that's similar to cutting, like slaughtering. Then you're slaughtering it for the sake of the idol, and then it's going to be forbidden from the start. But if you hadn't done it that way, it wouldn't be. Amar Rabbi Abahu Amar Rabbi Yochanan. How do you know if you slaughter, again, taking the same idea, we're going to have it in another ramification, if you slaughter an animal that's a blemished animal to the idols, you're going to be exempt. Where do we get it from? Shenema? The same pasuk we had before. And anything you slaughter to the gods is forbidden, other than to God, meaning if you can do it to God and instead you bring it to the idols, it's going to be forbidden. You can't bring a Baal Mum, an animal that's blemished, inside the temple, so you're exempt. But Havi Barava, Rava said, what kind of mum, blemish are we talking about? If it's some problem in the eye, which is a small problem that Jews can't bring on the altar. However, since a ben Noach could actually bring it on their altars, so we're going to ask for Avodah Zarah. In other words, that's not even a mum according to them. So we must be talking about where it's actually missing a limb. As Rabbi Elazar said, how do we know how do we know that missing a limb is forbidden to a ben Noach? We've learned all this. This is a sugya on Daf Yomi bet. We'd have a whole repeat of this sugya. Mikol achai, mikol basal shnai, mikol Noach brought into the ark, and this would be then the halacha for the bnei Noach, all two from all animals. Amra Torah, habebema shechayin rashe ivarim shalanu. It said mikol achai, mikol basal. Why does it repeat all living? all flesh, right? From all the flesh. Could it just say from all the flesh? Why does it say all the living? To say it has to be alive with its limbs, no broken limbs. So now they say, maybe all the living ones actually means to say not an animal that's going to die soon. And that's what you need to bring into the ark. So they say, oh no, that we learned from nafka. That we learned from lachayot zera. There it said also we had to bring animals that could procreate. So a treifa can't. Well, it depends what you think. That would be a good answer that the chai isn't coming to exclude the treifa because um, the word lahachayot is coming to exclude a treifa. But hanicha damar treifa in a yoled. This is only if you say treifa doesn't give birth, right? But el damar treifa yoled. There's machloket about whether an animal that's treifa could actually have offspring. So, ma'ika. So what would it be? Ma'ika lememar. What can you say in that case? Amarkra itach. Itach bedomim lach. Now we're going to learn treifa actually comes from a different pasuk. They have to go with you into the ark. With you means they have to be like you, and Noach wasn't a treifa. Now, how do you know Noach wasn't a treifa? V'dilma Noach gufei treifa, but maybe he was a treifa. Tamim k'tiv be, no, because it says he was tamim, which means complete. Tamim is usually the opposite of a balmum. It's a pure animal, not having any blemishes. Dilma, but wait, when we say Noach was tamim, we don't think, oh, he wasn't a treifa. What do we normally think? He was tamim b'drachav, the way he acted. His mido were perfect. So they say, no, tzaddik tibeh, that is already referenced in the verse he was a tzaddik. Well, Dilma tamim b'drachav tzaddik b'masav, maybe he was tamim in his midot, in his traits, and he was a tzaddik in his actions. And maybe those are two different things. So they say, fine, even if you were to say that, still, Dilma, still clearly Noach wasn't a treifa. Lo matzita amar Noach gufa treifa havi. Now, if we start with the assumption that itach means like Noach, then we're going to prove from here that Noach clearly wasn't a treifa because Isa gadatach Noach treifa hava. Amalei Rachmanad kavatech ayel shleimim lo ta'ayel. What God's saying, I want ones like you who are treifo to come in and not good animals. That doesn't make any, not unblemished animals. Doesn't make any sense. So it must be Noach wasn't a treifa because otherwise, why would God say, I want animals like you to come into the ark? So from there, we said treifa is learned from a different pasuk. L'chol chai comes to say you can't have a broken limb on an animal, but then Noach can't offer that in the temple. And again, that was all. If we go back, that was all to say that the ben Noach. Okay, so let's just go back to the beginning. We said there, if it's dukin shaba'ayin, right? If the ben Noach couldn't bring it, then obviously we're going to be liable if we bring if it, right, right. One second. Right. If a ben Noach can bring a dukin shaba'ayin on the altar, then of course you're going to be liable for bringing an animal with a dukin shaba'ayin. In other words, if it's a small blemish, and the Gentile can bring it on his altar, and you bring it on the Gentiles on the idol's altar, of course you're going to be liable. The question is, what if you bring an animal? And not the question, but the halacha that you're not going to be liable is if you bring something that they couldn't bring on the altar, like one that's missing a limb, then you're not going to be obligated at all because even they can't bring it, and that's what we just proved. Now, now we just have a side question, which is once we learn from itach the whole issue of the treifa, which we tried to learn from lachayot zera, right? We originally tried to learn from mikochai. That for sure now, because that's where we learned the aver, the broken limb. We also said you couldn't do it from lachayot zera, but maybe they can reproduce. So therefore, they learn from this itcha. Once we learn from itcha, lachayot zera lama lido, even though it did work according to one of the opinions, still it's unnecessary. Now, what do we need that pasuk for? Really, according to both opinions, that we don't know what to learn from there. If from itcha you would have thought maybe Noach just needs ones that can be partners with him, like have company on the ark. But and it could be even an old animal or a castrated animal. How do we know? Therefore, we learn from lachayot zera, it has to be animals that can actually procreate. And we all know that because that was why Noach brought them into the ark, but they have to prove it. Amar Rabbi Elazar, and we talked about markulis. The way you worship markulis is by throwing stones at it. Now, What if you slaughter an animal to markulis? How do you know you'll be liable? Shenemar v'lo yizbachu oret tzivchehem l'seirim. Now it says you can't bring zvachim to the seirim. The seirim were these idols. Now, if the way we worshipped seirim, right? So that is an idol, and we assume the way we worship it is through bringing sacrifices. So you don't need a pasuk to tell me don't slaughter animals to the Sirim, because I already know from a different pasuk, and we'll see that right now, it's Imenu Anyan L'Kedarka. It can't possibly be saying it if that was the typical way to worship it, because and from that pasuk, how do the Goyim worship their idols? You should find out, because that's what you're not allowed to do. Okay, you can't worship any idol in the way that they worship it. So if this pasuk was coming to say, in a case where that's how they worship the idol by bringing animal sacrifices, you don't need it for that because you have the other pasuk to teach you that. Therefore, so it must be to teach you, even if it's not the normal way. Okay, so you have markulis, which they don't normally slaughter animals, but if you slaughter an animal and offer it up to the markulis idol, then you're going to be liable. And that's learned out from that pasuk. The problem is they're going to say, what do you mean? We need that pasuk for something entirely different. From here, we're going to tangent off. You can't learn it for that. You need that pasuk for the following bright. Now we're going to move to Amud Bet. Ad kanu medaber b'kodashim shikdishan b'shat isur bamot v'klivan b'shat isur bamot. Okay, what you have to do is, we're not going to do this in class, but I recommend you do it, which is go look in Sefer Dvarim in chapter 17, verses 1 to 7. There it's talking about slaughtering animals outside the temple. Okay, so Adkam from the beginning until that pasuk, okay, that's where that pasuk comes. Okay, that pasuk is pasuk zayin. Okay, until that pasuk, chukat olam tiyeh. Okay, this will be a law to you. Until then, they're talking about kodashim shikdisham b'shad isur b'mot b'klivan b'shad isur b'mot. Okay, we're talking about a time where there was a time before there was a Mishkan and after the Mishkan. Now, when the Mishkan was built, it's already forbidden to sacrifice outside of the Mishkan, outside the tabernacle. What if you had an animal? Now, the first part they're talking about, which is don't bring sacrifices outside the temple or outside the holy place, right? Which is the sanctuary, which is the tabernacle at that point. They're talking about when you took an animal to bring as a sacrifice after already the tabernacle is in existence, and then you sacrificed it after the tabernacle is in existence. So the whole thing happens after. That's what the first set of psukim we're talking about. Sharei on shamamor, and it says there, v'petach ol moed lo avio, and you didn't bring it to ol moed. Okay, onesh shamanu azhara minayin. Okay, I have to read the rest of that pasuk. Petach ol moed lo avio. Dam yechashiv lishahu, dam shapach. It's as if you spill blood because you slaughtered this animal for no reason because you're not allowed to slaughter it outside. You get karet for that. So if the animal was again, you both did you consecrated it, said, I'm bringing this on the altar, and then you brought it on the altar outside the temple, you get karet. Asharami Nayim, where's the warning for that? Okay, look in, that was Pasuk Dalid. Now look in a different chapter, chapter 12, verse 13, be careful not to offer your olod, your burnt offerings, anywhere you want. Now, what do you see from here? Like Rabbi Avin says in the name of Rabbi Eli. We've seen this many, many times. Those words, Hishamer, make sure, pen, that you don't do this, that's a negative command. So we have a warning, we have a punishment, that's all if it was both consecrated and offered once already there was a tabernacle or a temple in existence. Mikam va'elach, but starting after that, okay, from that pasuk, hu medaber b'kodashim shekdisham b'shat eter b'mot v'klibam b'shat isur b'mot. Okay, now we're going to say from then on, okay, from verse 8, it says, Laman asher yaviu b'nei Israel, so that b'nei Israel will bring their zvachim, asher hem zovchim, that they sacrifice al pnei sadeh, on the fields, ve'vi'am el la'Hashem el petach ol moed, and then they bring them to God into the entrance of the ol moed, to the kohen, v'zapuz v'chesh lamim la'Hashem. Now, they're going to say, is here, this is already talking about What if I consecrated an animal before there was a tabernacle or before the temple was built? And then the temple was built and I offered it outside, which I was originally going to offer it outside when I consecrated it. That is still going to be forbidden, but it's not as severe. You don't get curried for it. So that's what we're going to read right now. So Lamana Sheyaviu B'nai Yisrael Tzivchem Asher Him Sovchim Shitarti L'Chakfar. What does it mean Asher Him Sovchim? They were already permitted to be brought out here. Al Pnei Sadeh, in the fields, meaning they were permitted to be brought in the fields, okay, not in the temple or the tabernacle. Milamed Shekol Zoveach Babama B'Shad Yisur Abamot Ma'aleh Alav Katuv Ki'ilu Hu Zoveach Al Pnei Sadeh. Now, what's this Al Pnei Sadeh as a double reference? It's saying on one, it was permitted to you originally, but now it's forbidden to you, and it's as if you're slaughtering something in the fields, like to the idols, is what they mean here. And then it says they have to be brought to God. That means the mitzvah to do it right, bring it to the temple. And how do we know there's a negative? Self, we get to what we wanted. You probably don't remember over here. Because it says in the previous pasuk, and they will not offer their zvachim, we say that's the negative commandment here for if I consecrated while there was no tabernacle, and then there was a tabernacle, and I sacrificed in the outside the tabernacle, then there's an aseh, meaning I have to bring it to the temple. That's number one. If I do it outside of not fulfill my positive commandment, and it's a negative commandment of don't offer the zvachim. Now, you might have thought I got karet for this. No, because Talmud Lomar, it says in the pasuk, in the Zlois of Chutz Chukat Olam Tia Zot Lahem. Notice Zot Lahem. This will be a rule for them. Zot Lahem V'lo Acheret Lahem. Just this, meaning just a negative commandment, but not karet. So it's not as severe, but it is forbidden. Anyway, the whole point is, how could we learn what we were trying to learn, which is how do you know that if you slaughter an animal to markulis, that you're liable? And that's because lo yizbachu otzevchem l'sirim. And since it can't possibly be teaching you kedarka, we learned that from a different pasuk, it must be teaching you, even when it's not the typical way you worship this, if you bring an animal as sacrifice, since that's a typical way we worship most idols, therefore it's going to be forbidden. Okay? You're going to be punished. Now, so how do we learn both things from that pasuk? Not so complicated. Amarava kare bevelo yizbechu v'kare levelo od. There's two parts in that pasuk. Lo yizbechu od. Don't slaughter and don't slaughter in addition. Okay, so from there you can learn both halachot. Okay, new Mishnah. This Mishnah we saw before. Matzah b'rosho ma'ot uksudo kelim ha'reilu mutarim. If you find on the idol money or clothing or vessels, they're permitted. They're not considered part of the idol worship. Parkilev anavim va'atarot shel shibolim. But if it's any items like the grapes or the stalks and the wine and the oil and the fine flour and anything like this that could be offered on the temple, on the sacrifice, on the altar, it's going to be a problem. Okay, these are the stalks with the fruits on them. It's the perkule and the atarot. Okay, now. Anything that can be offered on the temple is forbidden. Minani Mile, where do we get this from? I'm Rav Chia bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yoshaya. Katuv echad omer v'tiru et shikotzehem ve'ekelu lehem eitz va'evin kesef v'zahav asher imahem. So one pasuk says, look at their disgusting idols that are made, right? That there's stone, right? There's wood, stone, kesef zahav asher imahem, with them. Okay, it doesn't mean they're made out of them. It means with them, there's all these possible things. You might find wood, stone, money, silver, and gold. Don't desire the silver and gold that is on those idols. Now, they're going to now make this comparison between imahem and alehem. Ma alehem, davar shel noi asul, she'eno shel noi mutar. Now, when things are on them, okay, notice what's listed there, just kesef and zahav, because kesef and zahav are adornments. Okay, they're decorative elements, ornaments. But only those things are there. Notice the eitz and evan aren't there. So therefore, and there, eino shel noi mutal, the eitz and evan aren't forbidden. Af imahem davar shel noi asul, she'eno shel noi mutar. Then also things that are with them. Okay, there's things on them, that has to be adornments. Well, since we're going to compare these two psukim, we're going to say, Also, imahem with them, like in front of them, which people kind of offer offerings to the gods and put them in front of them, it's only going to be things that are adornments and not other things. Okay, they're going to be permitted. So now they say, Ve'em alehem dumia di imahem. Why don't we do the opposite? Ma imahem komash imahem. Since imahem, we're going to say anything that's with them. Af alehem kosh alehem. Wouldn't you then say also anything on them? Anything should be forbidden. So they say, im ken lo yomar alehem. Because then you would have just said imahem. You would have known everything was included. So alehem must be coming to limit it and say not everything is actually forbidden. So now they say, okay, wait a minute. This whole section assumed that ma'ot is not an ornament, right? Not decorative. Ma'ot, davar shel noyu, right? But isn't money something of decorative element? And what does it say in our, now, they're saying money is a decorative element. And yet we say that money is permitted when you find it on the at, right? This is the whole thing here. We said if it's on it, it's only going to be forbidden if it's ornamental. Now it says, Matzah brosho ma'ot ksuro kelim hare elu mutarim. So ma'ot, isn't ma'ot, though decorative also? You could put money to decorate things. We're talking about a bag that's tied and hanging on the idol. That's not decorative. That's like somebody stuck it there. Okay, that's not forbidden. Ksut, the partial noid. Also clothing. We all know clothing is decorative. That's what people wear, I mean, besides wear it to cover their body, but it's also decorative. Well, we mean like something folded up and stuck on the head of the idol. That's not decorative. Kli, davar shel also in a vessel could be decorative. They just stuck it upside down on its head. Again, that's not very decorative. Amrav Asi Barchia. Now we're going to learn, it really depends where it is. If things are within, there was some sort of mechitza, like some sort of barrier they put around the idol, anything inside of that is obviously brought as an offer to the gods. Forget about whether it's ornamental or not, no matter what, even if it's mayim umelach, water and salt, which is usually considered nothing. Like who would bring that as an offering? But if it's within the klaim, within that mechitza, it's going to be forbidden. Chutz l'kol kalim, if it's outside of that, davar shel noy asul, she'eno shel noy mutar. It's all going to just depend whether it's decorative or not. Amar Rabbi Yossi bar Chanina, naktina, ein kilkalin, lo lepor v'lo markulis. Now he comes and says, I'm going to limit this though. In the case of markulis or por, there is no kilkalin. There's no thing around it. Now, which makes sense, by the way, if everyone was throwing the stones, right? There's no fence there or sort of partition. Lemai. So now they say, well, what are we trying to say here? Even close by, we're going to assume it's not an offering and it's permitted. Well, that can't possibly be. Since people defecate in front of it, what you think if there's water and salt there, they're going to say, oh, that's not good enough for Pa'or. I mean, Pa'or gets the worst of the worst. Anything near it's going to obviously be forbidden. So what they mean to say is the opposite. Even things that are far away are considered, right? Obviously not too far away, but even if they're outside that small area that's usually out around from the thing, since people throw things at it and defecate in front of it, any kind of distance or more distance anyway is going to be considered forbidden. You can assume the item was worshipped, was used to worship Peor or Makulis. New Mishnah. Avodah Zarah shayta lagina omer chatz. Nehenim mehem shelo b'tova ve'ein mehem b'tova. If you have an Avodah Zarah, like an idol worshiper that's there, and there's an idol there, which has a courtyard or a bathhouse, you can enjoy benefit from there as long as you don't pay for it. If you pay for it, then you're benefiting the idol. Okay, so you have to not pay. What if it belongs? Okay, what we mean here is we're talking also like it belonged to a komer for the Avodah Zarah, like a monk or a priest or something that's working for the idol. Now, what if it belonged to both the idol worshiper and or the komer, right, this priest, and to another person? So it sounds like you can benefit even if you pay for it because there's someone else getting benefit, not only the komer. But we're gonna have to talk about why this is okay. Avodah Zarah shalove kochavim asura miyad v'shal Yisrael ein asura ad shte'aved. Now we finally get in the Mishnah to at least one of the opinions. We're going to see later whose this is. But an Avodah Zarah of a Gentile is forbidden immediately once it's created. But Shel Yisrael, a Jew, it's not going to be forbidden until we actually worship it. Amar Abai, B'tova, what does B'tova mean? And this I already said based on this. B'tova komarim. It's you're giving money to the priest for the idol. Shelo b'tova komarim. You're not paying the priest for it. La fuke tovat ovdeh deshari. It sounds like if it's just a regular idol worshiper, you can actually pay for it. But some people say that Abaye's statement wasn't said about that line. It was actually said about the last line or the later line. If it belonged to both of them, to which Abaye said, then this explains this line totally differently. We said it's owned by two people. You can use it if you're not paying money to the komer. You have to make sure the money goes to the other person, not to the priest. And that's a very different understanding. Now, if you're going to say in the seifa, you can do it, all the more so in the reisha, right? That if as long as you make sure that there's no right, you would say also the tova is tova komarim. In other words, if you say the seifa that it's talking about, as long as the komer doesn't get it, of course, in the reisha, it's also saying as long as the komer doesn't get it, the money. But but if you say it's talking about the reisha, then the sefer you're going to understand totally differently the way we understood in the beginning, which is as long as it's shared, it's enough. You could give it to them because you can say, oh, well, maybe the priest is not necessarily going to benefit from it because maybe the other person will take it. But you don't have to be sure that the priest isn't benefiting from it. So now we're going to say, get into the machloket Rabbi Akiva, Rabbi Yishmael, and just get started on it today. Mani, who's the Mishnah like? Rabbi Akiva, it holds by Rabbi Akiva's position, Tanya, as it says in a Braita. Abei, we finally get to this machloket straight on. Abei tabdun kol hamakomot asher avdu sham hagoyim. Okay, wipe out all the places where the Gentiles are worshiping idols. Now, this doesn't mean wipe out locations. What does it mean? They're talking about vessels that they use for Avodah Zarah worship. What if they made them and didn't finish them? What if they finished them and didn't bring them? What if they brought them and didn't use them? You might have thought they'd be forbidden. Notice the pasuk says, what do you have to destroy? Items that they worshipped. Sounds like until they worship them, they're not forbidden. She'en asurin ad sheyavdu. Mikan amru, avodah zarah shel levei kochavim eina asura ad shtei avot, v'shel Yisrael asura miyad divrei Rabbi Yishmael. So from here, you learn avodah zarah is not forbidden, right? Immediately until they worship it. That's against what our Mishnah said, and that's Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Akiva omer chiluf hadvarim. He says it's the exact reverse. Avodah zarah shel levei kochavim asura miyad, v'shel Yisrael ad shtei avot, and that matches our Mishnah. The Gentiles is forbidden immediately, and the Jews only once you worship it. Okay, now where he gets this, we're going to see that later. We're going to see the opinion of Rabbi Akiva and understand it better what the source is in tomorrow's daf. Well, the thing we're going to finish up right now is Amar. We happened to mention this thing about it said destroy the places, and we said places means vessels. It's a little weird. So Amar, but it says locations. It doesn't say vessels. Well, but it can't be places because we already learned that you don't destroy land, you don't destroy mountains. Remember, therefore, okay, we'll stop here for a minute. For now, we'll finish this up tomorrow. But that's how we learn that mekomo means vessels, and then we're going to get back to Rabbi Akiva's opinion. Okay, so what did we do today? It's a bit of a long daf. We started with the whole issue of doing things like the way it was done in the temple, or can it just be similar in terms of an action of breaking something? We dealt with Rav's opinion there, and then we had some issues with it, and we had some questions about Markulis, how Markulis works. Then we got to the Behemat Ba'alat Mum. If you offer, you're not going to be liable. Then we had to figure out which mum exactly we're talking about. From there, we got into the whole thing about what a Gentile is allowed to bring a sacrifice of, and what he can't, what's a mum for them that's different from us. From there, we got to the Markulis. How do you know that if you slaughter an animal to Markulis, you're going to be liable? From Lo Yizbechu, but wait, don't we learn something else from Lo Yizbechu? From there, we got off on a whole tangent about Lo Yizbechu being something that originally you designated when there wasn't the Isser of Shchutei Chutz. of outside the tabernacle because there was no tabernacle or no Beit HaMikdash. And then by the time you offered it, there was one, and you still offered it outside. That's learned out from Leis B'chu that there's a negative commandment there, even though there's no karet. And from there, we said, well, you can actually learn two things. Then we got to the different items that are going to be forbidden if they're on, if they're decorative, they're going to be forbidden. If they're not decorative and they're on, they're going to be permitted. But if they're within a certain, right, within the walls around the idol, any item, because even water and salt, because that's how people offer things to their gods. They just bring them all sorts of items. It doesn't have to be decorative. And then we talked about the Markulis and Pu'or are different. They don't have that whole border around it. And from there, we ended with this Ginar Mechatz about the Tovan, Lo B'Tovan, and then the second line, and, and the two parts of that Mishnah and what Abai said his statement about. And we finished up with this Machloka, Rabbi Shmuel and Rabbi Kiva, which we actually mentioned earlier in the daf, and then we're hitting it head on right now. And we'll get back to that in tomorrow's daf. Wishing everyone a good day and a Shabbat Shalom.